devil's bargain. I've never believed in the devil. Sure, I've heard the stories. Cautionary tales whispered in hushed tones, told to frighten children into obedience. But those were just myths, right? Old-world superstitions with no place in the modern age. That's what I told myself, anyway. But what happened that night changed everything. Started with a dare. My friends and I were out in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, parked on the side of a lonely dirt road. The night was heavy, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and distant rain. We'd been drinking, laughing, telling ghost stories around a crackling fire. And then Jason, always the instigator, suggested we play a game. "Let's summon the devil," he said, grinning like a maniac. The others laughed nervously, but I felt a chill creep down my spine. "Don't be stupid," I said. "It's just a story." Jason smirked. "Oh, come on, Danny. Where's your sense of adventure?" I wanted to brush it off, to laugh with the others and let the moment pass. But Jason wouldn't let it go. He claimed he'd read about a ritual in some old book, an offering, a summoning, a way to make contact with something beyond. "If you're so sure it's fake," Jason said, leaning closer, "why don't you prove it?" I wish I'd walked away. The ritual was simple, or so Jason claimed. We needed a circle of salt, a candle, and something personal to offer as a sacrifice. The salt came from the chips in Jason's car. The candle was one of those cheap birthday candles someone had in their bag. And for the offering, Jason grabbed my old leather wallet, the one my dad had given me years ago. "Hey, that's mine," I protested, reaching for it. "Exactly," Jason said. "It has to mean something to you." I wanted to argue, but the others were watching, and I didn't want to seem afraid. Jason lit the candle and placed it in the center of the salt circle. Then he tossed my wallet next to it. "Now we call him," Jason said, his voice low and theatrical. "Say his name 3 times. I summon the devil." Felt ridiculous, childish even. But I didn't want to back out. We chanted the words together, our voices blending into the night. "I summon the devil. I summon the devil. I summon the devil." The fire crackled, the flames flickering unnaturally. A sudden gust of wind snuffed out the candle. For a moment, we were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was Jason playing some elaborate prank. But the voices didn't come from him or anyone else in our group. They came from the shadows. Low, guttural murmurs, speaking a language I didn't understand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. "All right, Jason, very funny," I said, my voice trembling. But Jason didn't respond. He was staring at the circle, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, rising into a deafening cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence was worse. Something was in the circle. It wasn't human. The figure was tall and thin, its body contorted at unnatural angles. Its skin was a sickly, mottled gray, and its eyes, its eyes, burned like hot coals, searing into me with a malevolence I couldn't describe. It smiled, revealing rows of jagged, 2 white teeth. "Who dares summon me?" it said, its voice a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We were frozen, too terrified to move or speak. The thing stepped out of the circle, and the salt crumbled beneath its feet as if it had never mattered. Jason fell to his knees, his bravado shattered. I didn't mean..." The creature's laughter was like the sound of grinding metal. "Didn't mean to call me? Didn't mean to offer a bargain?" Jason shook his head violently. "No, it was just a joke." The creature tilted its head, studying him. "A joke? Then I shall take my payment in jest." Before any of us could react, it reached out, its long, clawed fingers brushing against Jason's forehead. Jason screamed, a raw, guttural sound that I'll never forget. His body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head. And then he collapsed, silent and still. The rest of us ran. We didn't look back. I don't know how far we got before we realized Jason wasn't behind us. "I'm not going back," Emily said, her voice shaking, but I couldn't leave him. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I forced myself to return to the clearing. The fire had gone out, and the salt circle was gone, the ground beneath it scorched black. Jason was lying there, his body twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. But the worst part? The figure was still there. It turned to me, its burning eyes narrowing. "You've come back," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "How brave. Or foolish." Couldn't move, couldn't speak. I smiled, stepping closer. "Your friend made a mistake. But you came willingly." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. "I offer you a choice," it said. "Leave now and I will take him. Or stay, and I take you both." I don't know where I found the courage, but I forced myself to speak. "Take me instead." The creature's smile widened. "How noble," it said. "How predictable." It reached for me, its clawed hand gripping my arm. The pain was instant and excruciating, like fire coursing through my veins. The last thing I remember was its laughter, echoing in the darkness. When I woke up, it was dawn. The clearing was empty, the ground undisturbed. Jason was gone. The others said I was unconscious for hours, but I don't remember. We never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel it watching, and I know it's waiting for me to make the next move. The Devil's Whisper. I should have listened to the stories. You hear them growing up, about people who sought the devil's help and lived to regret it. I always dismissed them as folklore, campfire tales meant to spook gullible kids. I never believed in the devil, until I met him. It started with desperation. My life had been falling apart for months. A failed relationship, mounting debts, and the creeping despair that gnawed at me day and night. I'd spent weeks searching for solutions and finding none. That's when I stumbled across an online forum. It was a dark corner of the internet, a place for people seeking alternative solutions, among the usual nonsense about spells and rituals. One thread caught my eye: how to summon the devil. The responses were chillingly serious. People claimed they'd done it and shared their results. Riches, revenge, impossible dreams fulfilled. The price? He'll ask for something in return, they said. Always something you can't refuse. I thought it was a joke, a sick, elaborate hoax. But as I sat alone in my tiny apartment, the weight of my failures pressing down on me, I decided to try it. What did I have to lose? The instructions were disturbingly simple. I needed a dark room, a mirror, and a single black candle. At exactly 3 a.m., I was to light the candle, stare into the mirror, and repeat the phrase, "I summon the devil. I seek your aid." I laughed at myself as I set it up. The mirror was an old, slightly warped one-eyed found at a thrift store. The candle was left over from a Halloween party. As the clock struck 3 o'clock, I lit the wick, dimming the room in a soft, flickering glow. The first time I said the words, my voice cracked. The second time, I felt a chill creep up my spine. By the third, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath visible in the air. And then I saw him. His reflection didn't appear all at once. At first, it was just a shadow, faint and insubstantial. But as I watched, it solidified into a figure. He stood just behind me, tall and lean, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to drink in the light. His face was pale and sharp, with high cheekbones and eyes that burned like embers. But it was his smile that froze me in place. Too wide, too sharp, filled with a predator's amusement. "You called," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "What do you desire?" For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat felt dry, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out my thoughts. "Well," he prompted, leaning closer. His presence was suffocating, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I want my life back," I finally stammered. "I want to be happy again. To have money, success, love, everything I've lost." His smile widened. "Easily done," he said. "But you know the rules. Nothing comes without a price." "What's the price?" I asked, my voice trembling. He chuckled, a low, bone-chilling sound. I'll let you know when the time is right. It should have been a red flag. I should have questioned it, demanded details, anything. But in that moment, all I could think about was escaping my misery. I agree, I said. The devil extended a hand, his long, claw-like fingers curling around mine. His skin was ice cold, his grip impossibly strong. Done, he said, and then he was gone. The changes started immediately. The next morning, I woke up to an email from a job I'd applied for months ago. One I thought I had no chance of getting. They wanted me to start the following week, with a salary that felt like a dream. 2 days later, an unexpected check arrived in the mail. It was from an insurance claim I'd completely forgotten about, and it covered all my debts with money to spare. Within a month, my life was unrecognizable. I had a great job, a beautiful apartment, and a new circle of friends. Even my love life took a turn for the better. I met someone who seemed perfect, like they'd walked straight out of my dreams. Everything was perfect, until the whispers started. They came at night, soft and insidious, threading through my thoughts like poison. First, I thought it was my imagination. A stray sound here, a whisper of wind there. But the words grew clearer. You made a deal. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was stress, a byproduct of my sudden success. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me everywhere. In the quiet hum of my office, in the rustling leaves outside my window, even in the moments of intimacy with my partner. You belong to me. The worst part was the shadows. They crept into the edges of my vision, darker than they should have been. They moved when they shouldn't, twisting and writhing like living things. One night, I woke to find the room filled with them, a mass of shifting darkness that coiled and stretched toward me. And in the center of it stood him, the devil. You've been enjoying my gifts, he said, his voice a silky purr. But now it's time to pay. What do you want? I whispered, my voice barely audible. He grinned, his eyes glowing like molten fire. Your soul, of course. But first, a little fun. The next few days were a waking nightmare. My perfect life unraveled in ways I couldn't explain. My boss turned on me, accusing me of mistakes I hadn't made. My partner left without warning, their face blank and cold as they walked out the door. The shadows followed me everywhere, growing darker, more menacing. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The whispers became screams, echoing in my mind until I thought I'd go mad. I tried to reverse the deal, to banish him, to undo what I'd done. But every attempt ended in failure, met with his mocking laughter. You can't escape me, he said one night, appearing in my mirror as I huddled in the corner of my apartment. You called me. You chose this. I didn't know. I screamed. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. His smile turned cruel. Ignorance doesn't absolve you. I don't know how long I can keep going. The shadows are closing in, suffocating me. The whispers are louder than ever, telling me to give in, to let him take what he came for. But I can't. I won't. If you're reading this, heed my warning. Never call the devil. No matter how desperate you are, no matter how tempting it seems. Because once he answers, he never lets go. The devil's hand. I never believed in the devil, not really. Sure, I grew up hearing the tales, the ominous warnings from old folks who claimed to have seen things they couldn't explain. Don't bargain with the devil, they'd say, their voices low and shaking. I used to laugh it off, chalking it up to superstition. But that was before that night. That night, I learned that some stories are true. It started innocently enough. I was at my wit's end, trying to figure out how to keep my business afloat. I owned a small bookshop, the kind that smelled of aged paper and forgotten dreams. It was my pride and joy, but the bills were piling up, and fewer people seemed interested in physical books anymore. I tried everything: promotions, social media ads, even hosting local events to bring people in. But nothing worked. The shop was dying, and with it, my dream. That's when I stumbled across the old book. I found it tucked away in the back of my store, in a box of donations I hadn't gone through yet. It was a leather-bound tome, its cover cracked and faded, with no title or author. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with strange symbols and handwritten notes in a language I couldn't decipher. As I flipped through it, one page caught my eye. It was written in English, scrawled in uneven letters. To summon him, light the black candle. Speak his name thrice. Offer what is most precious, and he will grant your desire. I should have closed the book right then and there, but desperation does strange things to a person. That night, after closing the shop, I decided to try it. What did I have to lose? I found a black candle in an old box of Halloween decorations. I set it on the counter, surrounded by the clutter of unpaid bills and overdue notices. The book lay open beside it, its ominous words staring back at me. The clock struck midnight. I lit the candle, the flame flickering unnaturally. The air seemed to grow heavier, the shadows in the room deepening. I took a deep breath and spoke the words aloud. I summon thee, devil. I summon thee, devil. I summon thee, devil. The flame sputtered, then roared to life, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. The room grew colder, and I felt a presence, something watching, waiting. And then he appeared. He stepped out of the darkness like it was a doorway, tall and lean, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit. His skin was pale, almost luminescent, and his eyes burned like embers, smoldering with a malevolence that made my blood run cold. He smiled, a sharp, predatory grin that revealed too many teeth. "You called," he said, his voice smooth and rich, like honey laced with venom. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it you desire?" he asked, tilting his head as if studying me. "Wealth? Power? Revenge?" My voice cracked, cleared my throat and tried again. "I need to save my shop. I need money, enough to pay my debts and keep the doors open." His smile widened. "A modest request. Easily granted." He leaned closer, his eyes boring into mine. "But you know the price." I hesitated. What do you want?" His grin turned cruel. "What do you think is most precious to you?" My mind raced. I thought of my family, my friends, my memories. The shop, my dream. "The shop is everything to me," I said, my voice trembling. "It's all I have." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Then it shall be yours." For a time, before I could ask what he meant, he extended a hand. His fingers were long and clawed, his nails sharp as razors. "Do we have a deal?" I stared at his hand, at the blackened veins that pulsed beneath his pale skin. "I don't have a choice, do I?" I whispered. "There is always a choice," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "But time is running out." I reached out, my hand trembling, and took his. The moment our hands touched, I felt a searing pain, like molten iron branding my palm. I screamed, but he held on, his grip unyielding. The room spun, the shadows writhing like living things. And then it was over. He was gone, the candle extinguished, the room silent. The next morning, the changes began. I woke to find an envelope on the counter, filled with crisp bills, enough to pay off every debt and then some. Customers started pouring into the shop, drawn in by some invisible force. They bought books by the armful, praising the magical atmosphere. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. But the hope didn't last. It started with the whispers. Late at night, as I worked on inventory or tidied the shelves, I'd hear them, soft, insidious murmurs that seemed to come from the shadows. "You made a deal." First, I thought it was my imagination. But the whispers grew louder, more persistent. "You owe him." The shadows began to move, shifting and twisting in ways they shouldn't. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of something lurking just out of sight. A figure tall and lean with burning eyes. And then the customers changed. They weren't normal anymore. They'd walk into the shop with strange, glassy eyes, their movements stiff and unnatural. They'd smile too wide, their teeth sharp and gleaming. "You've done well," one of them said, their voice echoing with a distorted, otherworldly tone. "He's pleased." I tried to ignore it, to pretend everything was fine. But the whispers wouldn't let me forget. "You can't escape." I confronted the devil. One night, as the clock struck midnight, I lit the black candle again. The air grew heavy, the shadows deepened, and he appeared. "You're back," he said, his grin as sharp as ever. "Is something wrong?" "This isn't what I wanted," I shouted. "The shop, the customers. None of this feels real." He laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, it's real," he said, "but everything has a cost." "What do you want from me?" I demanded. He leaned closer, his eyes blazing. "You'll see." The shop burned to the ground a week later. I don't know how the fire started. I was there one moment locking up for the night, and the next, flames were consuming everything. I barely made it out alive. As I stood outside watching the inferno, I saw him. He stood in the flames, untouched, his smile mocking. "Our deal is complete," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "But I lost everything," I screamed. He tilted his head. "I gave you what you wanted, and I took what was most precious." And then he was gone. I've tried to move on, but he's always there. In the shadows, in the whispers that haunt my nights. If you're reading this, take my advice. Never make a deal with the devil, because he always takes more than you're willing to give. The devil's debt. They say desperation makes people do dangerous things. I never believed that until I found myself face to face with something I can't explain, let alone escape. My story begins on a cold October night. I was alone in the crumbling remains of my family's old house, a place I'd inherited but couldn't bring myself to sell. It was falling apart, but it was still home, at least in a symbolic way. The truth is, I was broke. The job market had chewed me up and spat me out, and the debts were piling up. I was out of options. The house was eerily quiet that night, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors or the distant howl of the wind through broken windows. I sat in the kitchen, nursing the last bottle of whiskey I could afford, trying to come up with a plan. My eyes fell on an old wooden chest tucked under the sink, a family heirloom I'd always ignored. Something about it caught my attention that night. Maybe it was the way the dim light seemed to glint off its brass lock, or maybe it was the whisper of curiosity that comes from too much alcohol and not enough sense. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling it out and prying it open with a screwdriver. Inside was a book. It was old, bound in cracked black leather, with no title or markings on the cover. As I flipped through its yellowed pages, I realized it was filled with strange symbols and handwritten text in a language I didn't understand, except for one page. That page was written in English, scrawled in uneven, hurried handwriting. "If you seek salvation, light a flame and call his name. But beware, for his gifts are never free." I should have closed the book right then and there, but desperation makes people do dangerous things. It wasn't hard to find a candle. The house was full of old junk like that. I placed it on the table, struck a match, and lit the wick. The small flame flickered in the drafty room, casting long shadows on the peeling walls. I hesitated, the rational part of my brain screaming at me to stop. But the thought of another sleepless night, drowning in worry, was unbearable. "Devil," I whispered, feeling foolish. "Devil, devil." The room went still. The flame froze, no longer flickering. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest. Then the shadows began to move. He stepped out of the darkness as if it had solidified around him. Tall and lean, dressed in a black suit that shimmered like oil, he smiled at me. His teeth were too white, too sharp. His eyes burned like coals, glowing with an unnatural light. "You called?" His voice was smooth, dripping with mockery. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my heart pounding in my ears. "You need help," he said, his grin widening. "I can smell desperation. It clings to you like smoke." He circled the table, his movements fluid, predatory. "What is it you desire? Wealth? Power? Love?" I swallowed hard, finding my voice. "I need money. Enough to pay my debts, to get my life back on track." He stopped, his head tilting like a curious animal. "Money is simple, but nothing is free. You understand that, don't you?" "What's the price?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. His smile grew impossibly wider. "The price is always the same. something precious, something irreplaceable. I should have asked more questions. I should have been smarter, but I was blinded by the thought of relief, of escape from the crushing weight of my problems. So I nodded. Fine, deal. He extended his hand, long fingers ending in nails that were just a little too sharp. When I took it, pain lanced through my palm. I cried out, but he held tight. The room spun, the shadows writhed, and his laughter echoed in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The room was empty, the candle was out, and on the table was a stack of cash. At first, everything seemed perfect. The money was real, more than enough to pay off my debts. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I fixed up the house, bought new clothes, even treated myself to a decent meal at a restaurant. But the good fortune didn't last. It started with the mirrors. One morning, as I was shaving, I noticed something off in my reflection. My movements didn't quite match. There was a delay, a flicker of something unnatural. I brushed it off as stress. Then came the whispers. Late at night, I'd hear them in the corners of the house, soft and insidious. You owe him. I told myself it was my imagination. But the shadows began to move when they shouldn't, stretching across the walls like living things. One night, as I lay in bed, I woke to the feeling of someone watching me. I turned over, and there he was, the devil, standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "It's time," he said, his voice a low growl. "For what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To collect," he said, stepping closer. "You didn't think the money was free, did you?" I tried to argue, to plead, but he silenced me with a wave of his hand. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls twisting and melting. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. "What is most precious to you?" he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. I thought of my family, my memories, my very soul. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't move. His hand reached out, clawed fingers digging into my chest. The pain was unbearable, like fire and ice all at once. When I woke, the house was silent. The money was gone. The repairs I'd made were undone, the walls crumbling and the furniture decayed. But the worst part was the emptiness. It wasn't just the house, it was me. Something was missing, something vital. My memories were hazy, my emotions dulled. He had taken something from me, something I couldn't name, and I knew he wasn't done. Now I sit in the ruins of this house, waiting. The shadows move on their own, whispering his name. I see his eyes in every mirror, feel his presence in every corner. I don't know what he'll take next, but I know he'll come for it soon. If you're reading this, remember my story. Desperation makes people do dangerous things. But no matter how bad things get, don't call him. Because once you make a deal with the devil, there's no way out.